starting at down there.
Far left.
Far left.
No.
Far left. I like that phrase. Nancy
Positionally,
L.
not politically.
No muttering. Nancy L. Cohen. We have Eric Deggans and Karen Sternheimer. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but I just wanted to just talk about a little bit about the concept of culture war. I started thinking about what is it? What is a culture war? And it turns out pretty much everything. Because it is how we now frame pretty much every issue in this country. And I just was startled to stop and think, how did that happen? How did abortion and, I have a whole list here from Wikipedia, stem cell research, right to die, legal drinking age, decriminalization, harm reduction, capital punishment, law and order, separation of church and state. All of these things are, framed as good, one side or the other, one side or the other. We've all heard about this polarization for a long time. So we're going to talk about how we got there and what we can expect in the future. So I'll do a proper introduction now. Nancy, back to my far left, Nancy Cohen is a historian, journalist, and author of 3 books on American politics. She's been published in the LA Times, Playboy, RollingStone.com, other publications, and she's currently a visiting fellow at Occidental College, and her latest book is called Delirium, How the Sexual Counter-Revolution is Polarizing America. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
Okay. Eric Deggans is a TV media critic for the Tampa Bay Times. He does commentary for NPR. He also writes on sports media for National Sports Journalism Center. And he was named as one of the most influential Black Americans by Ebony Magazine. And this is his first book, and it's called Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. So welcome, Eric, all the way from Florida. Last but hardly least is Karen Sternheimer. Karen is a sociologist at USC, right here. She writes about media and society, and this book is her 4th book. One of her previous books is called Celebrity Culture and the American Dream: Stardom and Social Mobility. She has been or is a contributor to Huffington Post, New York Times, LA Times, and other publications. So welcome, Karen. Oh, and her current book is called Connecting Social Problems and Popular Culture: Why Media is Not the Answer. I'm sorry, I'm working backwards here. I forgot to tell you, please silence your cell phones during this session. And following the panel, there will be a book signing. And the book signing for this panel is located at Signing Area 1. And it's on the map. I'm not entirely sure where that is, but that's where the signing will be. And you are not allowed to record this session. Okay. So before we get started, I just wanted to read some excerpts from each book. And I really recommend them all. And my own book, but I'm not, won't talk about that. And there's a lot of overlap here between race baiting, the feminist counter-revolution, and the role of the media in driving everything. And in Eric's book, early in the book, he says, his basic premise is that that media is really very niche these days. We all know that. It's very, very targeted at certain audiences. And he writes, today's fastest growing media platforms now focus on smaller segments of the audience, the plumpest parts of a seriously fragmented viewing, reading, listening public. And one way to ensure that those audience segments develop fierce loyalty is to feed them messages demonizing other outlets and the groups who might gather there. It may sound cynical, but in a fragmented media culture, hate sells. And he ties that all to race. And in Nancy's book, Delirium, How the Sexual Counter-Revolution is Polarizing America, fascinating book, and she actually takes you back to 1972. How many of you remember the presidential campaign 1972? Well, not too many. Okay, well, she actually is giving us the history of sort of the backlash the conservative backlash to a lot of issues, and this is what she calls a sexual counter-revolution. And she quotes, in 1972, George Meany, who was then the head of the AFL-CIO, who was very much against George McGovern, who was then the presidential nominee, who died this past year. And there was a great deal of alarm about George McGovern opening the door for, homosexuals and blacks and all. There was a lot of fear around that at that time. So George Meany she quotes him as saying at that 1972 convention in Miami, "We listen to the gay lib people, the people who want to legalize marriages between boys and legalize marriages between girls and girls. We heard from the abortionists, and we heard from the people who looked like Jacks, acted like Jills, and had the odor of Johns about them." And this sounds eerily like how we're talking now about the same issues. Okay, and finally with Karen's book, which is very interesting because we always like to blame the media for so many things. It's always the media's fault, right, for perpetuating all sorts of immoral things. And in her book, she talks about how we have to think about the influence of media on young people is something we worry about, right? The young people. And she has a section in her book where she talks about the whole notion of childhood and why, how that came about, why we have to protect it. And so she says in her book, she's talking about how we actually created the concept of childhood and adolescence after the Great Depression. Apparently before the Depression, there were only adults. After the Depression, we had leisure time, we were more relaxed, and suddenly there was the youth market. And she writes, the shared space of high school led to the creation and growth of youth culture. Young people's taste in music grew to bear more resemblance to their peers than their parents. Parents complained that young people wasted their time listening to the music and were not as industrious as prior generations, a reflection of children's exclusion from the labor force and increase in leisure time. This was particularly true following World War II, when economic prosperity coupled with mass marketing created even more distinction between what it meant to be a child, a teenager, and an adult. And she goes on to say that we are so afraid of what the media does to young minds. So that's my introduction to you all. And so we can just open it up, and any one of you can start and perhaps talk a little bit about, the scope of your book and what you were trying to get at. Any volunteers?
Oh, I can start. Okay.
You can.
Basically, the premise of this book is that I think a lot of people's view of media has not kept pace with the actual form of media. Our view of how media outlets become successful is that they get the biggest audience. And that was true 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But now the way media becomes successful is they focus on the biggest small niches of audience, and they super serve that audience. I call it the tyranny of the broad niche. So if you're Comedy Central, you're focused on young white males. If you're Lifetime, that's your home for women in peril movies for middle-aged women. It's just every cable channel and media platform has their audience that they're super serving. But there are some platforms that use prejudice and stereotypes and outright racism to draw in an audience and keep that audience from going to other platforms. So Fox News Channel, to use one example, doesn't just say that we're the best at covering news. They say the other outlets will lie to you. They are liberally biased. They are corrupt. And in that way, they try to insulate and bring in their audience and keep that audience from migrating to other platforms. And I always tell people when I give lectures, if you want to understand 95% of what happens in media, someone's losing money or somebody's making money. So look at where the money-making potential and imperative is in media, and you understand why prejudice and stereotypes rear their ugly heads in different ways.
And I think I'm looking at media in a different way, whereas you're looking more at news media or what passes for news media. One of the things that I look at in my work is fears that we have about media. And I think what's especially relevant for our topic on the culture wars is that culture wars are often fought on the backs of children. The things that are allegedly harmful to children kind of amp up this sense that we're fighting a battle between good and evil. And what I've looked at in my work is how the media itself, and I don't necessarily mean the news media here, but whether it's video games, television, movies historically. Now we're seeing more concerns about texting and other social networking, that somehow it is these new forms of media that are